June 3, 2026, 2:47 a.m. 9 drones on the water, no engines, no radar signature, no warning. By 3:04 a.m., the Kavkaz ferry terminal was burning. I'm your host at Steelfront, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Tonight, we're breaking down a strike that went further than destroying docks and ferries. We're talking about how Ukrainian GUR naval drone operators executed a precision package that didn't just hit a port. It cut the last heavy logistics artery keeping Russian forces in occupied Crimea alive. Because the Kerch Bridge wasn't enough. Storm shadow strikes had already taken out the rail span in April 2026, forcing Russian logistics to pivot entirely to the Kavkaz ferry crossing. Every tank, every ammunition truck, every fuel barge, every North Korean artillery shell headed for the peninsula had to cross that narrow stretch of the Kerch Strait by ferry. And Ukrainian intelligence knew it. They'd been watching for weeks. What you're about to understand isn't just a drone strike. It's a case study in strategic patience, precision targeting, and the kind of adaptation that makes Ukrainian operators the most dangerous naval force operating without a traditional navy in modern warfare history. By the time this analysis is done, you'll see why the 72 hours following this strike may have shifted the trajectory of the Southern Front entirely. Stay with me, because what unfolds in the next 18 minutes dismantles everything Russia thought it understood about defending its logistics corridor. The story begins not on June 3rd, but 3 months earlier, when Storm Shadow cruise missiles struck the Kerch Bridge rail span on April 11th, 2026. Russian military planners didn't panic. They had a contingency. The Kavkaz ferry terminal on the Taman Peninsula on the eastern shore of the Kerch Strait had been running as a secondary logistics route since the first bridge strikes back in 2022. With the rail span gone, Russian command redirected everything through the ferries. 6 ro-ro vessels, 2 fuel barges, a rotating schedule of military vehicle transport runs, civilian traffic cleared for priority military throughput during night hours. On paper, it worked. Which weapon proved deadlier in this operation? HIMARS rockets, naval drones, or the intelligence network that made both possible? A. HIMARS. B. Magura drones. C. GUR intelligence. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to it. By mid-April, Ukrainian satellite imagery analysis confirmed the throughput surge at Kavkaz. The numbers were stark. Vehicle staging areas on the Crimean side of the strait had expanded by nearly 340% compared to February baseline imagery. Russian military convoys that had previously dispersed across multiple routes were now funneling into a single choke point. Fuel storage capacity at Kavkaz had been upgraded. Analysts spotted new barge moorings and expanded holding tanks along the terminal's southern pier. GUR understood the strategic geometry immediately. This wasn't just a ferry terminal, this was Crimea's aorta. I spent considerable time working through the open-source intelligence trail on this operation, and one detail kept surfacing in Ukrainian Defense Ministry briefings from May 2026, a specific focus on fuel logistics. Not vehicles, not ammunition, fuel. Without a functioning fuel supply chain, Russian armored units on the peninsula couldn't operate. Artillery couldn't fire. Air defense systems couldn't reposition. Fuel was the force multiplier that made everything else possible, and the Kavkaz terminal was processing an estimated 800 to 1,200 metric tons of military fuel per week by late May. That's why the target package included not just the ferry infrastructure, but specifically the 2 fuel barges moored alongside the military vehicle transport at the southern pier. GUR Naval Drone Command authorized the Magura V5 strike package in the last week of May 2026. Planning took 11 days. The Magura V5 is not a prototype. It's a proven combat system, 6 meters in length, displacement of roughly 850 kilograms at combat load, twin electric motors producing near-silent surface propulsion, capable of speeds reaching 42 knots when required, but typically run at reduced speed for acoustic concealment during approach phases. Each unit carries a warhead package in the 200-kilogram range, enough to catastrophically damage or sink vessels up to destroyer class when striking at the waterline. At this point in the war, Magura drones had already demonstrated effectiveness against the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Sergei Kotov corvette, the Caesar Kunikov landing ship, multiple patrol vessels. Each strike had refined Ukrainian operator tactics, developing what military analysts began calling multi-vector convergence, approaching multiple drones from separate compass bearings simultaneously, designed to overwhelm point defense systems and force them to prioritize among multiple simultaneous threats. For the Kavkaz strike, GUR planners took this further. 9 Magura V5 units, 3 vectors, 3 drones each approaching from northwest, northeast, and due east. Convergence time calculated to within 90 seconds of simultaneity at the target zone. Here's the complication that almost unraveled the entire operation. The launch positions had originally been designated along a section of the Ukrainian coastline, offering favorable concealment and approach geometry. But 11 days before the scheduled strike window, Russian signals intelligence assets detected anomalous radio traffic in that sector. Not enough to confirm a drone operation, but enough for Russian command to reposition a patrol boat and increase aerial reconnaissance flights over the approach corridor. The original launch plan was compromised. GUR planners had 72 hours to redesign the approach geometry from scratch. New concealed river positions were identified, tributaries feeding into the coastal zone that offered both concealment and a modified approach vector, taking the drone formation wider south before curving northeast toward the strait. The route was longer. It added approximately 90 minutes to the transit time, and it required operators to navigate their drones through more complex coastal geography with limited direct line of sight for portions of the route. The operators adapted, because that's what Ukrainian drone crews do. They don't just use weapons, they reinvent how those weapons are used, operation by operation, every time the environment changes. New launch timing was set for 1 a.m. on June 3rd. The drones would need to maintain position holding patterns at designated waypoints, while the formation synchronized for the 3-vector convergence approach. The final run-in to the terminal was calculated to begin at 2:38 a.m., with the impact window targeted between 2:47 and 3:01 a.m. Russian forces at Kavkaz were not expecting this. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes at that terminal destroys Russia's logistics capacity for 72 hours and triggers a chain of consequences that Ukrainian HIMARS crews had been waiting weeks to exploit. At 1 a.m. on June 3rd, Ukrainian GUR operators initiated launch sequence from concealed positions along the modified river egress routes. 9 Magura V5 units entered the water. Transit to the first waypoint holding pattern took approximately 40 minutes. The night was favorable. Sea state 1 to 2. Light wind from the northwest, approximately 8 to 12 knots, enough to create ambient wave noise that would further mask the drone's acoustic signature during approach. Thermal imaging conditions were good, which meant Russian thermal sensors along the strait could theoretically detect surface heat signatures. But the Magura's electric propulsion generates minimal thermal output, and at approach speeds of 12 to 15 knots in the pre-terminal run, the signature is marginal even under ideal sensor conditions. Russian air defense on the Taman Peninsula had been repositioned following previous Ukrainian drone and missile strikes. The S-400 batteries that had previously covered the strait approaches had shifted inland to prioritize coverage against Storm Shadow and ATACMS threats from the north and northwest. Point defense for the ferry terminal itself consisted of 2 ZU-23-2 autocannon systems mounted on the pier structures and a single Pantsir-S one-wheeled unit positioned on high ground approximately 1.8 kilometers from the water. For air Air threats, that's a credible defense posture. For 9 surface drones approaching at wave height with minimal thermal and acoustic signatures from 3 simultaneous directions, it was nearly useless. At 2:38 a.m., the Magura formation broke from its holding pattern and began the final approach. The northwestern vector's 3 drones pushed ahead at 28 knots, closing the distance in approximately 11 minutes. The northeastern vector matched timing through a slightly longer route at 32 knots. The eastern vector, with the most direct approach geometry, maintained 22 knots to synchronize arrival. At the terminal, Russian ferry crews were conducting routine night operations. One of the Ro-Ro vessels, the military vehicle transport designated by Ukrainian intelligence analysts as Ferry Alpha, was loaded and preparing for departure. 2 fuel barges, tracked by OSINT analysts through commercial satellite imagery, were moored alongside. A second Ro-Ro vessel was at the loading dock taking on the first vehicles of the night convoy. How many vessels did Ukrainian Magura drones damage or destroy in this strike? A, 3, B, 5C, 7? Answer coming at the end of this breakdown. Russian radar systems at Kavkaz detected something at 2:44 a.m. Small surface contacts, moving fast. But the returns were inconsistent. The Magura's low profile and the wave clutter of the strait created ambiguous radar signatures that the duty operator initially classified as wave returns or possibly debris. 3 minutes. That's how long it took to escalate the contact report to the terminal watch officer. 3 minutes during which 9 surface drones were closing at combined approach speeds that had already eliminated most of the defensive reaction window. The Panzer S-1 crew received the alert at 2:47 a.m. The first impacts occurred at 2:47 a.m. and 40 seconds. Put yourself in the position of the Russian terminal watch officer for a moment. You're receiving a radar contact report that's still being classified. The duty operator isn't certain. And then the fuel barges explode. 2 Magura V5 units from the northwestern vector struck the fuel barges in rapid succession. Impact interval of approximately 4 seconds. The warhead detonations at the waterline of Barge 1 and Barge 2 ignited approximately 600 metric tons of military diesel and vehicle fuel. The secondary explosion was catastrophic. Satellite imagery reviewed the following morning showed the thermal bloom from those secondary detonations exceeded 180 meters in radius at peak intensity. The fire spread. What's most surprising about this strike isn't the drone precision. It's what the secondary explosions did to Russian defensive reaction time. The fuel detonations at 2:47 a.m. created a near-total visual and thermal whiteout over the southern pier sector. Russian Zu-23-2 gunners on the pier structures were physically blinded by the flash and overwhelmed by the heat. The Panzer S-1 system's targeting radar struggled to discriminate between the drone signatures and the massive thermal and radar clutter generated by the burning fuel. In the 90-second window following the initial fuel barge impacts, 6 more Magura units struck their designated targets. Ferry Alpha, the loaded military vehicle transport, took 2 direct hits at the waterline on its starboard bow. The vessel listed immediately and began taking on water. A third Magura struck the crane infrastructure at the primary loading dock, detonating against the base structure of the main loading crane and collapsing it across the dock approach. The second Ro-Ro vessel at the loading dock was struck once, midships, igniting vehicle fuel from the military trucks already loaded aboard. Subscribe to Steelfront if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what we're analyzing here isn't just a drone strike. It's systems-level thinking applied to logistics warfare. 3 additional ferries moored at the northern pier section caught fire from burning fuel that had spread across the water surface from the barge detonations. Russian crews aboard 2 of those vessels managed to cast off moorings and move them away from the spreading fire, but both sustained hull damage from heat and debris and were non-operational. The third vessel's crew didn't clear the dock in time. It burned at its moorings. By 3:04 a.m., 17 minutes after the first impact, Kavkaz terminal operations had ceased entirely. The Pantsir S-1 crew did fire. 4 engagements confirmed by Ukrainian drone footage reviewed post-strike. 3 of those engagements appear to have been directed at Magura units that had already completed their attack runs and were either destroyed on impact or withdrawing. 1 engagement was against a drone still inbound and missed. The Zu-23-2 systems on the pier never engaged effectively. Their crews were dealing with burning structures, secondary explosion fragments, and in at least 1 case, a pier section collapsed from the burning crane. Here's what this tells us about Russian defensive doctrine in this war. Kavkaz was not treated as a military installation requiring serious point defense. It was treated as logistics infrastructure. Important, yes, but protected by the assumption that no threat could reach it effectively. That assumption had already been disproved multiple times by Ukrainian drone operations across the Black Sea. Russian command continued planning as though previous strikes were anomalies. They weren't anomalies, they were the learning curve. The strike was over. The terminal was burning. 9 Magura units had executed a near-perfect multi-vector strike package. But what came next, what Ukrainian planners had built this entire operation to enable, hadn't even started yet, because the HIMARS crews had been waiting. Here's the layer of this operation that most analysts covering the strike missed entirely. The Kavkaz strike wasn't the mission. The Kavkaz strike was the setup. GUR intelligence had identified something critical in the week before the June 3rd operation. On the Crimean side of the Kerch Strait, at the Kerch ferry terminal, and along the R280 staging road running southwest from the terminal, Russian command had been accumulating armored vehicles awaiting ferry transport to the mainland for repositioning. 2 armored columns, one consisting primarily of T-72B3 main battle tanks and BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles. The second, a mixed column of Tornado GMLRS systems and logistics vehicles, had been held at the staging area for nearly 4 days due to ferry schedule backlogs. Those columns were stationary, in the open, on a road with pre-registered Ukrainian artillery coordinates. But striking them while the ferries were running was strategically suboptimal. Columns that could move would disperse as soon as artillery began falling. And Russian air defense coverage on the Crimean side was denser, making sustained artillery engagement riskier. If the ferries stopped running, the columns couldn't move. If the columns couldn't move, they would remain stationary on that staging road. And stationary targets on pre-registered coordinates are not battles. They're executions. That's exactly what GUR had planned. At 6:30 a.m. on June 3rd, approximately 3.5 hours after the Kavkaz terminal went dark, Ukrainian General Staff reports indicate that HIMARS batteries on the northern Zaporizhzhia axis fired the first strike package against the Kerch staging road. Satellite imagery analysis confirmed the columns were still in position. They had nowhere to go. The M142 HIMARS system carries 6 M31G MLRS rockets per pod. Range, up to 70 kilometers for the standard M31, extended to 150 kilometers with GMLRS-ER munitions that had entered Ukrainian service in late 2025. Each rocket carries a 90-kilogram unitary warhead with GPS and inertial navigation guidance, achieving circular error probability of approximately 5 meters. In practical terms, if you can see the target on satellite, you can destroy it with HIMARS. Ukrainian HIMARS crews fired in controlled salvos, 6 rockets, reload, 6 more. The targeting data had been developed over the previous 48 hours specifically for this strike window, the window that would only exist if the Kavkaz drones succeeded. The first volley targeted the T-72 and BMP column. Satellite imagery reviewed later that day showed 6 direct hits along a 400-meter column stretch. 4 T-72B3 tanks destroyed outright, 2 BMP-3 vehicles destroyed. Multiple logistics trucks in the column's tail section struck by proximity effects. If you believe tactics win wars, type "Steel Front" in the comments. because what you're watching here is a textbook demonstration of how multi-domain operations work. Naval drones creating the conditions for land-based fires, all enabled by weeks of patient intelligence work. The second volley targeted the Tornado G column. Russian MLRS systems are priority targets. Each Tornado G carries 12 rockets with a range of 90 kilometers, making them extremely dangerous if they reach firing positions. Ukrainian intelligence had specifically flagged these systems as high-value targets in the pre-strike planning package. 3 Tornado G systems were struck in the second salvo. Ukrainian sources indicate that at least one of the MLRS vehicles had ammunition loaded for transport, resulting in a secondary detonation that destroyed a fourth vehicle. Approximately 47 minutes of fire missions. Then, HIMARS crews displaced, the standard counter-battery evasion protocol that has kept Ukrainian HIMARS systems survivable throughout the war. Russian counter-battery radar systems tracked the approximate launch areas, but the 47-minute displacement window was sufficient. No HIMARS assets were lost in the operation. Here's the take that may generate disagreement among military analysts. The Kavkaz operation demonstrates that Russia's command culture cannot adapt quickly enough to Ukrainian operational tempo. The intelligence enabling the HIMARS strikes on the Crimean staging road had been developed over weeks. The strike had been planned in extraordinary detail, including contingency planning for the compromised launch route. And yet, Russian command, with access to their own intelligence about the drone threat level in the Black Sea, did not take the basic precaution of dispersing the armored columns waiting at the Kerch terminal. They knew the threat existed. They had seen what Magura drones did to the Black Sea fleet, and they still left 2 armored columns stationary on an open road, waiting for ferries that Ukrainian operators were about to destroy. That isn't a logistics failure, that's a command culture failure. The inability to translate threat awareness into protective action is a systemic Russian military problem that has repeated itself from Kyiv to Kherson to Kursk, and it keeps costing them equipment, lives, and strategic position. The Pantsir S-1 unit that failed to intercept the Magura drones at Kavkaz? 3 days after the strike, Ukrainian HIMARS crews destroyed it at its repositioned location, guided by satellite imagery of its displacement route. By June 4th, 72 hours into the terminal blackout, a second operational complication had emerged for Ukrainian planners. Russian engineering crews had begun emergency assessment of the Kavkaz damage, and preliminary reports intercepted by Ukrainian signals intelligence indicated that Russian command was considering an emergency vehicle bridge, a pontoon crossing solution over the narrowest crossing point of the Kerch Strait, approximately 3.5 kilometers from the terminal site. If Russia could establish even a temporary pontoon capability, they could partially restore vehicle movement within 96 to 120 hours. GUR flagged this as an immediate threat to the operational window. The response was an immediate intelligence tasking to commercial satellite operators and Ukrainian reconnaissance drone assets to maintain persistent surveillance over the pontoon equipment staging areas on the Taman Peninsula. Within 18 hours, imagery confirmed that Russian engineering units were moving pontoon bridge components to the Kavkaz area. Ukrainian planners authorized a follow-on HIMARS strike package targeting the pontoon equipment staging area before assembly could begin. The strike was executed on June 5th. 2 of the primary pontoon platform sections were destroyed outright. Russian engineering crews dispersed the remaining equipment to 3 separate locations, significantly complicating and delaying any assembly effort. The 72-hour blackout extended to over 100 hours before partial ferry operations resumed using 1 vessel that had survived the strike undamaged, having been away from the terminal on a crossing run at the time of the attack. 1 vessel, against a pre-strike capacity of 6, for a logistics corridor that had been processing an estimated 200-plus vehicles per day. The impact was immediate and measurable. Ukrainian General Staff reported on June 6 that satellite imagery confirmed Russian armored vehicle concentrations on the Crimean side of the strait had grown by over 60% from pre-strike levels, as vehicles continued arriving from the peninsula's interior for the crossing that could no longer accommodate them at previous capacity. Those staging concentrations became additional HIMARS target packages. The operational geometry had turned into a compound trap. One detail that stuck with me when reviewing the post-strike OSINT analysis: intercepted Russian communications from the Kavkaz terminal command element in the first 2 hours after the strike showed a command structure that was not just surprised, it was paralyzed. The watch officer's initial contact reports identified the drone returns as possible debris or small craft. The escalation chain took over 5 minutes to reach a level of authority that could authorize active defensive measures. By that point, every Magura unit had already completed its run. 5 minutes. In a military environment where the entire attack window lasted 17 minutes and the critical vulnerability period, the time from first potential detection to first impact, was less than 6 minutes. A 5-minute command response delay isn't a communication failure. It's a structural failure of defensive command culture. Russian doctrine at static logistics installations still assumes that the decision-making window for responding to a threat is measured in tens of minutes. Ukrainian drone operations have compressed that window to seconds, and Russian command has not successfully adapted its response protocols to match that reality. What would NATO defensive doctrine have looked like at a facility this strategically critical? Comment your analysis below, because the defensive planning failures at Kavkaz raise questions that go well beyond this single operation. By June 7th, Ukrainian military intelligence had completed its preliminary battle damage assessment for the entire operation package. The Kavkaz strike and the follow-on HIMARS missions combined had produced the following estimated results. At the terminal itself, 2 fuel barges sunk or destroyed. Ferry Alpha and 1 additional ro-ro vessel sunk at moorings. 1 ro-ro vessel beached after being severely damaged by fire. 3 additional ferries with significant heat and debris damage requiring dry dock repair. Terminal loading crane infrastructure destroyed. Fuel storage facilities at the southern pier destroyed. Estimated fuel loss: 600 to 800 metric tons of military-grade fuel. On the Kerch staging road, 4 T-72B3 main battle tanks confirmed destroyed by direct hits. 2 BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles destroyed. 3 Tornado GMLRS systems destroyed, with 1 additional loss to secondary explosion. 11 logistics vehicles destroyed. Estimated personnel casualties across the staging road strikes. Ukrainian sources assessed 35 to 55 personnel. Pontoon bridge equipment: 2 primary pontoon sections destroyed. Russian engineering capability to emergency bridge the strait delayed by an estimated 14 to 21 days. Total estimated equipment value destroyed across the entire operation package. Ukrainian military analysts assessed the figure at approximately 85 to 110 million US dollars when accounting for the ferry vessels, the armored vehicles, and the terminal infrastructure. 9 Magura V5 drones, a planning window of 11 days, and 1 operational contingency that could have destroyed the entire mission, didn't, because Ukrainian operators were prepared to adapt. The Kavkaz operation has already entered the curriculum at multiple Western military staff colleges as a case study in multi-domain logistics interdiction, using low-cost autonomous systems to create the conditions for high-precision fires, multiplying the effect of each individual weapon system by sequencing their use within a unified operational design. The lesson isn't just about drones. It isn't just about HIMARS. It's about intelligence-driven patience and the willingness to build complex operational sequences rather than striking targets of opportunity as they present themselves. Ukrainian command took 3 months of watching Kavkaz, 11 days of planning, a critical contingency adaptation, and then executed a 17-minute attack that generated a 100-hour logistics blackout and a follow-on fires window that destroyed tens of millions of dollars in Russian military hardware. That's not luck, that's doctrine. And it's a doctrine that Russia has consistently failed to counter, because countering it requires not just better defenses, but a fundamentally different command culture, one that treats threat information as actionable, distributes decision-making authority to the tactical level, and accepts that the era of treating logistics infrastructure as a safe rear area is over. Will Russia's Kavkaz terminal fully recover in time to prevent the logistics crisis from affecting frontline operations in Crimea? Comment yes or no, because the answer depends on variables that are still unfolding as of this analysis. Now, the quiz answer. How many vessels did Ukrainian Magura drones damage or destroy in the Kavkaz strike? The answer is B, 5. 2 fuel barges, Ferry Alpha, 1 additional ro-ro vessel sunk or catastrophically damaged, and 1 ro-ro vessel beached after severe fire damage. 3 more vessels sustained significant damage from the spreading fuel fire, but were not sunk. 9 drones, 5 vessels, 17 minutes. 3 questions worth considering as you close this analysis. Was the decision to plan the Kavkaz strike around the ferry terminal rather than targeting the vessels in open water the right tactical choice? The terminal gave GUR planners a fixed, pre-registered target zone and enabled the simultaneous fuel barge strike that generated the critical secondary explosions. But terminal strikes also risk collateral effects on civilian infrastructure that open water engagements avoid. Was the added lethality worth that trade-off? Could Russia have prevented this? The intelligence about Magura drone threat levels was available to Russian command. The pattern of Ukrainian multi-vector convergence attacks had been documented in previous Black Sea operations. The decision to rely on a Pantsir S-1 positioned 1.8 kilometers from the water, rather than deploying additional close-in weapon systems on the pier structures themselves, was a choice. Was it the wrong one? And what would you have done differently? As the GUR planning officer who had to redesign the entire launch geometry in 72 hours after the original route was compromised. The modified river approach worked, but it added 90 minutes to the transit and required more complex operator coordination in the pre-dawn hours. Was there a faster solution that would have maintained the strike timing? The Kavkaz terminal is operational again at partial capacity. Russian engineers are rebuilding the loading crane infrastructure. Replacement ferries have been sourced from commercial operators and pressed into military logistics service. The crossing is working, slowly, but the wrecks are still there, visible in satellite imagery, resting on the strait bottom and along the burned dock sections. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes the assumption of safety in rear area logistics, that a 200-kilogram warhead traveling silently on the surface of dark water is enough to collapse a strategic corridor, and that the force willing to build a plan, adapt when it breaks, and execute with patience and precision will keep finding leverage against a larger adversary. This is Steel Front. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. Subscribe to Steel Front, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Kerch Strait is quiet now. The ferry lights have come back on. But 9 wake trails across dark water changed the calculus of the Southern Front. And Russia's planners still don't have an answer for what comes next. Stay vigilant.